I call this meeting to order. So welcome to meeting number 61 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Public Safety and National Security. We will start by acknowledging that we are meeting on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin people. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the House Order of November 25th, 2021. Members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application. Pursuant to the order of reference of Wednesday, September 28, 2022, the committee commenced consideration of the annual report 2021 of the National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians. We welcome today in person four representatives of the Committee of Parliamentarians on National Security and Intelligence, which I shall henceforth call NSECOF, as everybody else does. We have the Honourable David J. McGuinty, Chair, Senator Francis Larkin, Member, Lisa Marie Inman, Executive Director, and Sean Jorgensen, Director of Operations. Welcome to you all. Thank you for being here. So as agreed prior to the meeting, up to 10 minutes will be given for opening remarks, after which we will proceed with rounds of questions. Mr. McGuinty, if you please, go ahead, 10 minutes.
Well, thank you very much. Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair and members of the committee, for your invitation to appear today before you. I am joined, as you have just heard, by Senator Francis Larkin, Lisa Marie Inman, the Executive Director of the Secretariat, and Sean Jorgensen, the Secretariat's Director of Operations.
To be here to discuss the committee's 2021 annual report. The report accomplishes two objectives. First, it fulfills the committee's legislated annual reporting requirements. And second, it summarizes the special report we completed in 2021, which was our cyber defense review. I'm going to begin with the committee's four annual reporting requirements. First, our annual reports must include the number of times that a minister determined that a review we propose cannot proceed because it would be injurious to national security. To date, this has not occurred. Second, our annual report must disclose the number of times a minister refused to provide information to the committee because the information constituted special operational information and would be injurious to national security. To date, this has not occurred. Third, we are required to report the number of issues a minister referred to us for potential review. In 2021, there was one such referral. On June 4th, the Minister of Health sent a referral to the committee regarding possible security incidents at the National Microbiology Laboratory in Winnipeg. Fourth, we are required to include our findings and recommendations. In 2021, the committee came to four findings and made two recommendations, all as part of the Cyber Defense Review. I will discuss that report later in my remarks. And in addition, Mr. Chair, pursuant to the Avoiding Complicity in Mistreatment by Foreign Entities Act, 12 departments are required to provide their minister with an annual mistreatment report and then to provide it to NSECOP as soon as feasible. All 12 departments have provided us with their annual mistreatment reports. Next, I'd like to highlight that last year the committee marked its 5th anniversary. Since its creation in October of 2017, the committee has completed 9 reviews with 29 recommendations for the government. In 2018, the committee completed reviews related to the Prime Minister's trip to India that year, the military's intelligence activities, and how the Cabinet sets the government's intelligence priorities. In 2019, the committee completed reviews related to diversity and inclusion, related to foreign interference, the Canada Border Services Agency, and the collection and use of information on Canadians by military intelligence. In 2020, the committee completed an overview of the threats to Canada. In 2021, the committee completed the Cyber Defense Review. In 2022, the committee completed a review of the national security and intelligence activities of Global Affairs Canada. And presently, the committee is completing its review of the federal policing mandate of the RCMP. And in the interest of pursuing our second foreign interference review, the committee has temporarily paused its work on the review of the lawful interception of communications for security and intelligence activities. Members might recall that NSECOP is dissolved during writ periods and then reconstituted within 30 sitting days after the return of Parliament. And so therefore, Mr. Chair, over the past 5 years, approximately 1 year in total was not available to the committee to pursue its work. It was not operating because of 2 elections in 2019 and 2021. Passons maintenant au rapport spécial portant.
Now I would like to turn to the 2021 Special Report on the Government of Canada's framework and activities to defend its systems and networks from cyber attack. We conducted the review because of the importance of federal systems and networks which form part of Canada's critical infrastructure. These networks store large amounts of personal information and are used to deliver essentially every government service. Government networks are under relentless cyber attack by a number of states, most notably China and Russia, and may be vulnerable to malware and other forms of cybercrime. Today, the federal government is a world leader in defending its networks. But this was not always the case. In the early 2010s, China carried out damaging cyber attacks against 31 federal departments. This was a wake-up call in terms of the scale of the government's cyber vulnerability and its poor defenses. Since then, the government has incrementally developed a strong cyber defense system, both in terms of governance and technical capability.
Me to 2 of our findings. First, our report found that over time, the government's approach to cyber defense evolved towards one that considers all government systems as a single enterprise. This horizontal approach, colleagues, has considerably improved cyber defense, although we found it is challenged by the vertical nature of accountability in the government. Second, our report found that not all federal organizations receive the same cybersecurity protection. There are 2 related reasons for this. First, the Treasury Board's cybersecurity policies do not apply to the entire government. And when they do apply, they do not always apply evenly. Second, departments are not obligated to adopt the cyber defense services offered by Shared Services Canada and the Communications Security Establishment. This means that many federal organizations are entirely outside the government's cyber defense perimeter, while others pick and choose services and do not subscribe to them all. These gaps and inconsistencies undermine the enterprise approach to cyber defense. A system is only as strong as its weakest link. With all this in mind, the committee made 2 recommendations. First, the committee recommended that the government continue to strengthen the enterprise approach to cyber defense. Second, the committee recommended that the government fully bring all federal organizations into the cyber defense perimeter, and that the cybersecurity policy suite should apply to all federal organizations, including, Mr. Chair, Crown corporations. The government agreed with both recommendations. Indeed, we are pleased that for the first time, the government provided an official response to our recommendations in this cyber review. However, the government has still not provided any updates with respect to 20 other recommendations contained in 6 of our previous reviews. The last point that we would like to raise is that this year we expect Parliament to begin a comprehensive review of the NSECOP Act. We're aware that your committee has sought to be designated as the House Committee for this review. Once a committee is designated to conduct the review, the committee would be happy to make a specific series of recommendations about potential reforms of the Act. Today, I will only emphasize the importance of the committee's access to government information. Indeed, the committee faces several challenges to obtaining the information we are entitled to under the law and that we need to fulfill our mandate. For example, the committee is concerned that departments are applying an overly broad interpretation of what constitutes a cabinet confidence. In closing, I wish to say that all of our reports are the result of the incredible and dedicated work of my colleagues on the committee. The Cyber Defense Report is yet another example of a unanimous, nonpartisan review of a crucial government activity by a committee of security-cleared senators and members of Parliament from all major parties and groups. Thank you very much, colleagues.
Thank you, Mr. McGuinty, and thank you all for all of your work all these many years to work to keep us safe. We'll start now with our first round of questions. We'll start with Mr. Shipley for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the members for being here today and sharing your time. I'd like to start off with the first question being that maybe directed to Mr. McGuinty. If he has to pass this along, that's fine. Mr. McGuinty, at the beginning of March, the Prime Minister's office asked the Clerk of the Privy Council and the Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs to bring forward a plan to implement the 5 years of outstanding recommendations from your committee. Given that it is now mid-April, have any outstanding recommendations been implemented since that announcement that you're aware of?
I'm sorry, I missed a little bit of the question at the front end because I didn't have the earpiece on and I couldn't hear you.
So, no problem. I'll just, at the beginning of March, the Prime Minister's office asked the Clerk of the Privy Council and the Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs to bring forward a plan to implement the 5 years of outstanding recommendations from your committee. Given that is now mid-April, are you aware of any outstanding recommendations that have been implemented since that announcement?
Well, the committee received just, I believe, maybe a week ago or less, this document here, which is an attempt to update Canadians on recommendations to counter foreign interference in Canada's democratic institutions. I believe the assignment given to the clerk and to Minister LeBlanc by the Prime Minister was to speak directly to recommendations from not only NSECOP but two other authors who had evaluated the protocol process. I think the assignment was to let Canadians know how far the government has come in implementing our recommendations and their recommendations. We're encouraged with what we've seen, but we would encourage this committee to call the government again to perhaps provide more detail on how they're moving forward.
Well, thank you for that, and that's a nice segue into my next question. I was a little shocked to find out that the government has only responded to one report in the 5 years of NSECOP's existence. Do you think that a set time period in which the government must respond to your report should be implemented?
It's an issue that's live amongst the committee members, trying to ensure that the work that's done, that's very difficult, to be candid with colleagues. It's difficult, and it takes a long time to arrive at these recommendations, and we don't arrive at them lightly. The deliberations are long and extensive. There are some folks at this table who, I think, sat on our committee and understand what we speak here. We're hopeful that the government now will pay close attention, perhaps closer attention, to some of the recommendations, like, for example, what we put forward here today on cyber. Again, I would encourage this committee to ask the government to come forward and explain to what extent it has implemented the recommendations to bring more federal organizations inside the cybersecurity perimeter.
Thank you for that. Maybe I'll delve into that just even a little bit further. And we all obviously are sitting on committees, and it's great work that your committee is doing. And we all work hard on these committees. And sometimes I wonder, these reports, what happens to them? Do they just go sit on a shelf somewhere? From what I mentioned in my last question, is your committee sometimes feeling that way, that perhaps it's just not being acted on enough?
There may be some times when we're looking for more immediate take-up. Sometimes it's difficult to point to the effects of the work. For example, the new architecture of review in Canada has compelled many organizations which are now subject to review to actually buttress and create new units inside their departments. For example, the Department of National Defense. Previous to the existence of NSECOP and NCERA, the Department of National Defense didn't really have a formal mechanism to respond to external review. Now it does. that's encouraging. I think the new architecture review is pulling the government forward as a whole. There are some things we can point to directly. For example, the government did announce in the budget the creation of a foreign interference coordinator role at Public Safety, which is also in their recent report, Countering an Evolving Threat, the one I pointed to a minute ago. We've seen that some of the recommendations from NSECOP ends up directly in mandate letters from ministers like D&D, Public Safety. We've seen the Public Safety Minister act directly on a CBSA review recommendation and implement direct change. So we're always looking for more take-up, more traction, because the purpose of the committee, where we're here, is to improve the situation for Canadians.
And thank you for that. Mr. McGuinty, you touched on something in your open remarks that we will be soon implementing or starting a 5-year review of NSECOP. I know it might be a little premature, but just to get our minds centered around some things, is there any major themes that you would see as far as changes that we should be looking towards and implementing on that review?
Thank you. So I appreciate the question. And to tell you that, the committee has begun its work of thinking through this, but we won't be putting forward specific recommendations until we have a committee to refer it to. But the chair has already indicated to you that one of the things that's very important to us is the issue of access to information. And I want to stress generally that the departments have been very good, and we've developed a very respectful relationship with organizations that I think at the beginning were really, these politicians, these parliamentarians, are going to have access to this information. And there was some hesitancy there. By and large, it has been very good. But we have had specific incidents, and I think the chair referred to, where we think that certain departments have perhaps given too broad an interpretation to what's a cabinet confidence. The other question is, should cabinet confidences all be protected, or in what circumstances? They don't have to be. They can be, provided to us. So those are the kinds of issues that we will be deliberating on. And I think today the only one that we're, prepared to say, because we've raised it in our own reports and our own comments about our reports when we've released them, the two things about action or reporting back on recommendations being followed through on, and the issue with respect to access to information in a timely and fulsome way.
Thank you, Mr. Shipley.
I'm out of my time, so thank you all for the work you do. And
we will go now to Mr. Nur Mohammed. Go ahead, please, sir. 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you all for your appearing here and for being with us today. I'd like to dig in a little bit into the importance of this committee. Mr. McGuinty, you have done, and your team and your colleagues have done a remarkable job of making sure that the work that your committee does has been in the main nonpartisan, with a tremendous amount of collaboration, and with what I hope are recommendations that all of us take seriously. One of the concerns that I have over the course of the last few weeks particularly has been the attempt to politicize the nature of the work that you do. And I want to quote in specific a comment that was made by the Leader of the Opposition, in which he says, and I quote, "NSECOP has been used in the past and is being used here to avoid accountability. It takes place in secret and is controlled by Justin Trudeau." I think it's important for Canadians to hear firsthand from you as the chair, A, whether or not that is true, and B, how you believe the role of NSECOP should be seen, and most importantly, how Canadians should view the committee and the important work that your committee does. And perhaps, Senator Larkin, you might also like to weigh in on this.
The committee scrupulously avoids partisanship, and I think the highest compliment that's been paid to the committee since we began is a number of folks who have appeared before us have often said that if you were to close your eyes and listen to the conversation at the table, you actually don't know from which political persuasion the commentary is coming. We built what I think we like to refer to as a sort of nobility of purpose around the work. We think that there are some issues that transcend partisanship, that transcend any one government, and national security and intelligence is one of those issues. So it was a unique opportunity for Senator Lankin and I in particular, who've been there since the beginning, to stand up the organization. It was sort of like flying a fighter jet as we were building one. But the purpose of the committee really should transcend my chairmanship, our membership, the senior secretariat staff. It's an important mechanism for the future to allow for a full airing of classified information amongst colleagues from both houses to treat these very important issues. And look, we all respect and understand that what goes on in the other arena called the House of Commons or the Senate is natural. It's going to occur. The push and pull, the cut and thrust of that is democracy. But when it comes to access to classified information and the treatment and the handling of that information and the quiet, nonpartisan opportunity to deliberate as colleagues on behalf of 39 million Canadians, we think this is a really important structure for Canada going forward. And no matter who is in government, no matter who holds the seat as Prime Minister or Minister, or no matter who is, what configuration of the committee is. So there are comments sometimes about the role of the Prime Minister or of the government in the work of the committee, and they are, I would say, considerably off the mark. In the 9, 10, soon 11 reviews we've conducted, the Prime Minister of Canada has never instructed this committee to do anything. In fact, the only time we consult with the Prime Minister of Canada on our work is when we're presenting our reviews, when the product is finished. And the Prime Minister has an obligation to instruct the committee to redact, but on four very, very, very transparent grounds. And the team that's here with us today, not just the members, but our senior secretariat folks, are extremely agile when it comes to entering into a discussion with officials in the government to say, well, let's talk more about that proposed redaction. We always tend towards being more transparent rather than less. We think that's important for Canadians to understand. The debate that's going on now in the House, the Senate, and in society is an important one. It's a really important one. But it's also a teachable moment for a lot of Canadians. For example, what is classified information? Why is classified information classified? And when can it be shared? When can it not be shared? And why isn't it being shared? So Canadians get that. They can fully understand that. We're trying to do our part in helping them understand that. I'm sure Senator Lincoln has much to add to that.
We're not supposed to touch that, eh? Somebody else does it and turns it on. Just having a battle here back and forth. Yeah, so the chair, I think, said earlier about the work of the committee that all of our reports have been unanimous, and they're, as indicated, in some ways multi-partisan, but in other ways non-partisan. One of the things that I believe is such a strength of the committee is the fact that we do have cognitive diversity around the table. We have discussions, push and pull and think about it from this perspective, and it's not just on a basis of political ideology. It's a basis of backgrounds, the experience we bring. We've had people from the RCMP, we've had people from military, we've had people from provincial government. We have a range of individuals whose experience comes to bear in our consideration of items. So I think that that's very important. The chair indicated that there has never been a time when the Prime Minister, the PMO, or anyone weighed into our work, and I will echo that. I'll go further with him and say suggestions of sort are patently false. And there is no basis for that kind of a suggestion to be made because we protect ourselves in the nature of our work, as well as we've developed, I think, a competency that people respect, and they respect our work. And so it's been very much a good exchange. I do remember, because before I was appointed to the Senate a number of years ago, I was a member of the Security Intelligence Review Committee, which is the predecessor organization to NCIRA. And at that point in time, we were only reviewing CSIS at that point in time. But we made recommendations about the need for a more, broad review, which led to NCIRA. And it was active discussion between members of our committee and, people in the PMO and PCO of the day about establishing a committee of parliamentarians or a parliamentary committee. I mean, we weren't precise into that at that point in time. But what's interesting is all of us had some hesitancy about would a group of multi-partisan or non-partisan or whatever parliamentarians come together and be able to work in a way that respected all of the secrecy requirements and understanding the nature of national security and the damage that can be done. And I personally, having lived through those debates and up to this point in time, have an incredible confidence in the work that's being done there, and a great respect for the individuals who put on their hat when they go into the House of Commons or into the Senate and take off that hat when they come into our committee for discussion. And I think it serves Canadians well. And I think it serves parliamentarians well when they look at the result of it, because it isn't one-sided. It is a product of good deliberative discussion and collaboration and coming up with our recommendations.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you, Mr. Nur Mohammed. On y va maintenant, Madame.
We will now go to Ms. Michaud. Please go ahead for 6 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. McGuinty. Thank you for being here today along with your colleagues. Before going more into detail on the annual report, I read it, and you have mentioned that you are not going to provide a summary of your reviews in the annual report, but rather create special reports. Could you explain that? At the beginning, we provided an annual report, as we are required to do, and we combined that with the reviews. For example, we have one here on cyber attacks, and you can see that it's quite voluminous. It's quite a thick report. So we decided that instead of combining the reviews with the annual report, but rather do our reviews and then present them one at a time. It's easier for Parliament to deal with, and the Prime Minister, senior officials. So we decided to, instead of having 3 reviews and the annual report all together in one report, it was easier to present them as they came along. Thank you. Of course, it would be hard to look through the whole report and deal with that. In the committee, we talked about Canada's posture concerning Russia, how prepared Canada is to deal with that type of threat. And I know that you have done an in-depth study as well. You talked about the horizontal approach of the government and how it can deal with cyber attacks. When we questioned the witnesses that came before the committee, it was clear that there is no real requirement for the departments to subscribe to all of the services available to deal with cyber attacks. So that was understandable to some degree, but it isn't clear why the same resources were not used by all, why they didn't have to have the same services. Could you talk about that? It's a question of architecture. The Financial Administration Act gives deputy ministers and the heads of crown corporations the power to decide whether they are going to participate in the cybersecurity services that are provided by the government. And we feel that that is a major problem because we are only as strong as our weakest link. An agency, a crown corporation, or a department that is not protected by our high-quality cybersecurity system. So if one of these entities is not covered by these services and is hit by a cyber attack, that is where The whole federal cyber system is under threat. Therefore, we called on the federal government to change that legislation and to require that all entities, all Crown corporations, agencies, and departments be under the umbrella of the services provided by Shared Services Canada and the communications establishment. So what have you heard back from the government on that? We are still waiting for a response, an official one, but we are encouraged by what we have heard. The Treasury Board could be asked where things are at. As you explained, it could help departments that have decided to go ahead and be covered by these services, and it could help them encourage others. Is there a recommendation or any other information that you would like to provide to us today regarding cybersecurity? Because there is more and more talk about this, and just in the past week or so, we've had attacks against the PMO, Hydro-Quebec, and other organizations. So probably you have recommendations. Clearly, we don't have effective protection. I think that the committee would say without any hesitation that we are only at the start of all this. We are going to see this accelerating and becoming even more complex, and this is why we did 6 case studies that are presented in the report that have never been seen in public before to illustrate the risks of a federal system where not all agencies and departments are covered by our cybersecurity system. I think that members of this committee and others would find it very useful to look at this. The Natural Research Council lost 40,000 documents. National Defense was hit a number of times, and other Crown corporations have been as well. So we certainly need to be careful with Canadians' information. Thank you.
We go now to Mr. Julian. Please go ahead, sir. 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I would like to thank our witnesses, Senator Lankin, Mr. McGuinty. I would like to follow along the same lines as what Ms. Michaud has mentioned. 31 federal departments have been targeted. Most of them were targeted by China. But last week, we saw Hydro-Quebec, the Port of Quebec, and others that were targeted by Russia this time. So the first thing I would like to ask you is, how can we determine if a cyber attack is a success or not, whether the defenses were successful? As you said, we're going to have an increasing number of attacks, and they will be more and more complex. You said that we have a good system to protect our cybersecurity, but are we moving too slowly? Well, to begin with, the question about whether Russia was successful in penetrating these defenses, I think the communication security establishment would be the ones to ask. They would be in a position to answer that. We haven't looked in detail at the situation and what has happened over the last 2 or 3 issue if you wish. Yes, I can speak in French. Can you hear the English now?
As I was saying, the 6 case studies, Mr. Julian, illustrate and were chosen deliberately by the members to allow parliamentarians, Canadians, and readers to understand the practical implications of not taking steps to protect. As I say, the private company, the first time using CSE powers, that's the first time this case study has been made public. The CRA attack, called the Heartbleed attack, is case study number 3. Case study number 4, the National Research Council attacked by China. We talked about the loss of 40,000 files and used its access to the NRC to infiltrate other government organizations. Very, very expensive to clean that up, $100 million at least. Case study number 5, at DND, where huge amounts of data were stolen from DND by a foreign actor. And a Crown Corporation in case study number 6, where something more recent in 2020, where a state had compromised the network of a Crown Corporation. So are we slow off the mark to respond to this? I don't know if the committee really examined that. I don't know if we examined it comparatively. We do know that CSE's abilities are now increasingly called upon internationally. We know, for example, that the United Kingdom government has called Canada's CSE in to help with their cyber defense systems. So I hope I've answered some of your question.
Okay, let's come back to NCCOP. You did talk about reviewing a 5-year review. I hope I quoted this accurately. I put quotation marks around it, that one of the concerns that you had is an overly broad interpretation of cabinet confidence. And so does that make it difficult or more difficult for NCCOP to do its work? Firstly, that overly broad interpretation of cabinet confidence. And secondly, what are the other tools that you need to do your work better at a time when there's more threats around foreign interference, more threats around cyber attacks, more threats than we've experienced perhaps previously in our history as a country?
I'm going to ask Lisa Marie Inman to address the question of cabinet confidence because she's on the front line often dealing with this. But one of the things that might help the committee is positive reinforcement. Positive reinforcement from all parliamentarians, all parties, and the Senate are represented in the committee, and respecting the fact that the committee has to work in closed quarters, has to proceed with enormous discipline, can't go out and comment gratuitously on subjects that are part of media reports or the cut and thrust of debate. We really do try to focus on the evidence, focus on the classified information, and we like to think that the quality of the reviews speak for themselves. But on this question, if I could, on cabinet confidence, I think Ms. Inman is best placed to speak to it.
Thank you for the question. So as Senator Lankin had pointed out, the committee is not entitled to receive cabinet confidences, but it's also not prohibited from receiving them. So the particular issue that the committee had pointed out in some of its previous work, it's not so much that the committee believes that its work has been compromised or hindered by not being able to receive cabinet confidences. It's two-pronged. So first, departments aren't obliged to identify that they're not providing documents or relevant documents that are subject to cabinet confidence. So the committee doesn't know what it doesn't know. So if there's a document subject to cabinet confidence or information subject to cabinet confidence, the committee doesn't necessarily know that that document exists because it doesn't need to be provided. So the Act doesn't say you have to identify when you're not providing something. It just, the committee is simply not entitled to receive that information. So it's not necessarily that the committee has looked at things and identified, this is an obvious thing that we're missing. We need to go back and get that. It's more just that it's useful to know what exists so that the committee can gauge the extent of information it may not be receiving or information it should be receiving. Also, what we have noticed, and largely as a result of inadvertently getting information subject to cabinet confidence that was later identified as being cabinet confidence information, which are in those instances, we were able to discern that the application of the definition is sometimes very broad. And as I'm sure you all know, the definition in legislation in the Canada Evidence Act is quite broad. and can be taken to quite an extreme. So the question is, which cabinet competences are in need of protection from the committee? Are they all? Is there a category of cabinet competence that the committee should be receiving? To be able to really dig into that question, it would be useful to know what the committee is currently not getting, and to perhaps issue, some sort of guidance or clarify the definition in terms of government documents that need to be provided.
Thank you, Mr. Julian. So that wraps up our first round. We'll start our second round. It seems probable that we won't be able to do a full second round, but we'll start with Mr. Motz. Mr. Motz, go ahead. 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to the committee, Chairman McGuinty and Senator Lankin and the Secretariat officials. Thanks for being here. When I look back over my years so far in this responsibility, they pale in comparison to my experience on NSCOP. It was probably the best and most enjoyable time I've had, because it actually felt like you were making a difference. And why? It was nonpartisan, and it was legitimately nonpartisan. I can say that unequivocally. And so kudos to you guys for setting that up. It was well done, and I enjoyed my time there. There's so much I'd like to say and ask, and I'll try and focus it. I appreciate your comments on the same battle we had back then on the broad interpretations of cabinet conferences and the realization that people on that committee, and not only those on the Secretariat, but the members of the committee, Senate and MPs, have the same or higher security clearance than most cabinet ministers do. So that's important to remember, and we're bound by legislation on, and so there is frustration, and I think this committee needs to have full access to cabinet conferences, because that broader interpretation, doesn't allow full transparency. So, and I appreciate it. The other thing that I really appreciated about NSCOP is the fact that you, as chairman, have pushed for broader transparency on the redaction process, and I think that is key for public confidence in what we do, as whole of government. And I want to applaud those efforts. We're not there yet, but we're heading in the right direction. So thank you for that. I want to get to a question on cyber defense and cybersecurity, but we talked a couple of years ago.
Pardon me, Mr. Motz. So with the bells are ringing, we need unanimous consent to carry on. I propose we carry on to 5:30. Do we have unanimous consent? Very well. Thank you all. Carry on.
Thank you, Chair. We talk about legislatively there is a requirement to have the NSCOP review within 5 years. It's been nearly 7. What steps do you think we need to take to encourage that push a little harder, to make sure it happens? I believe, as others around this table believe, that this is probably the best committee to do that review. And when we do it, it should be some urgency to it, I believe. What would you, as a committee, as NSCOP, recommend, suggest to be focused on? We can get into lots of things, but what would you suggest we focus on?
Well, there are some practical challenges we do face from time to time. We're making, I think, great progress, and maybe Sean Jorgensen, our Director of Operations, can speak a little bit about the progress we've made on the redactions process. And let me just step back and just publicly thank you, Mr. Motz, for your service at NSCOP. You were a superb member and represented not only your constituents but your party and the House very well. We miss you, and thank you for your service. I think there are some practical challenges. For example, one of the challenges Lisa Marie Inman faces is we often can't get top secret interpreters. These are interpreters that we can't rely on interpreters, for example, who interpret for cabinet, right, because they're not sufficiently cleared. So we need a different category of interpreters. And so that's sometimes a bit of a challenge. During the pandemic, we managed to hold ourselves together by having people on very secure satellite systems and meeting across the country and so on virtually. Sometimes the pace
Sorry,
of...
Mr. McGinn, I don't mean to cut you off.
Yep.
I want to get into cybersecurity. One question, a follow-up
Oh, I'm
from
sorry.
Ms.
Okay.
Michaud and Mr. Julian.
Yep.
Now, the report on cyber defense and preparedness states that many government organizations, and we dealt with this a number of years ago, who Crown corporations do not fall under the requirement to Treasury Board policies on cybersecurity issues, right? And so you recommend that this needs to be fixed. And can you just speak, that hasn't happened as of a month ago, that has yet to occur. Can you tell and reinforce the urgency that those agencies fall under Treasury Board policy because the cyber attacks and cybersecurity affects them as well?
I would implore that this committee call forward here to this committee a number of federal government representatives, including the Treasury Board, perhaps CSE, Shared Services Canada representatives, to put those questions directly to them. They know what we've called for. They've seen the recommendations. But on the urgency, I think Mr. Jorgensen is best placed to give you 30 seconds on why this is so important to do now.
Thank you, Mr. Motz. 30 seconds. I think in case study 6, the committee was very clear that there wasn't just one Crown Corporation that was hit. CSE came out and said, in fact, and it's in the report, that there's indication that there was a number of them have been hit. This committee, Canadians, those Crown corporations will never know that they were hit by an advanced actor in this space, and that is the very reason why Treasury Board needs to be pushing harder in that space.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Appreciate
you, Ms.
your
Motz.
service.
We'll go to Mr. Moff now. 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Mr. McGuinty and Senator Lankin and others for being here today, and especially thank you for the work that you do on NCCOP. It's been in the news a lot lately, and I was reflecting, I'm so privileged and proud that I was on this committee when we created NCCOP, as well as INSERA. And at the time, Canada was late to the game in creating this committee. I think at the time the UK had a committee similar to ours for about 20 years. And so that's why we said we'll review it in 5 years. I think my friend's math was a little off. It's not 7, it's about 5.5 years. But because we wanted to see how it was working and how it evolved, and I'm disappointed to hear about the cabinet confidences, because that is something that we discussed at the time of the creation of the committee. But you were talking about top secret interpreters, and one of the things that I think has been missed in the conversation generally about NCCOP is that it's not top secret because you're not wanting to be transparent with Canadians. Can you maybe explain why you have a top secret clearance, why you're meeting in a different location, and why that's critical to the work that you do?
Thanks for the question. It speaks directly to the access that the committee has to classified, highly classified information. And that information is shared after a process of screening of top secret security clearance, a swearing an oath, and of effectively, as parliamentarians, signing away our parliamentary privilege. It's also important for members and Canadians to understand the government doesn't have a majority of members on this committee. It was actually designed so no government would have a majority of members on the committee. In fact, with the Senate and with the House combined, the government's always in a minority situation. But I also, I think it's important for members and Canadians to know, in the last 5.5 years, we've never, ever had to hold a vote. Everything has been unanimous. And if we haven't got a unanimous outcome, we go back at it again and deliberate. So it's important for us to remind Canadians that we deal with classified information and material, and we have to be careful how we use it, how we share it, because it speaks to, for example, the sources and methods behind it. Where did this information come from? How did our information collectors obtain the information? If it's shared publicly, that can put at risk those systems. It can put at risk the Canadians who are, good women and men who are working in security and intelligence in this country, who are working to help keep us safe and to deal with national security and intelligence threats. So we have to be careful and behind closed doors, because some of the information we get is from our Five Eyes partners. and perhaps it's shared with us in great confidence, not to be shared again, not to be passed on anywhere else in any other shape or form. So we've got to be very careful. There are privacy considerations that we have to work around. So the committee is not choosing to hide itself in a secure facility somewhere because it doesn't want to see the light of day. On the contrary, Senator Lankin and other members and Mr. Motz during his time at NSECOP were very forceful in helping the committee come to a conclusion, which is we want to be as transparent as we can. We want to share as much information as we can. We want to push out on the redaction process as hard as we can for Canadians' benefits. But this decision to do things in a secure facility, handling highly classified information, is not something that we've invented just because we want to be secret people. It's because we have to handle this information.
And you're required to keep it secret for life. It's not just during your time as a parliamentarian, correct?
That's correct under the Security of Information Act and under the oath that we swear and take. No information of this nature can ever be wittingly or unwittingly shared.
Would you agree that our democracy in Canada here is one of the strongest and most stable in the world?
I'm not sure I can answer that question completely. It's not something the committee has really applied its mind to. I would say, with respect to the cybersecurity review we've done, we've got progress to make. It's a work in progress. But I would want Canadians to understand that the system that we've evolved in Canada on the cybersecurity front at the federal level is very, very, very good and world-renowned, frankly. And we should be confident that we have a system in place that's keeping our information safe as well. But there's work to be done.
I know my time's up, but I just want to say I'm really proud of the work that you and the committee are doing, and I thank you sincerely for it.
Thank you very much.
Merci.
I'll pass it on to the members.
We will now go to Ms. Michaud. 2.5 minutes, please. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a question about international interference, foreign interference. The Prime Minister announced that NSECOP would do a review of foreign interference or possible interference in the 2019 and 2021 elections. There have already been some starts to investigations, and there is a special rapporteur that has been appointed by the Prime Minister. There have been calls for an independent public inquiry to look into these issues, because if Canadians' vote is not properly assessed or properly encouraged and so on, that's a problem. Now, you talked about confidentiality. Do you think that NSECOP is the best body to study this issue? This isn't a question that the committee has addressed or the members. We have received a request from the Prime Minister to continue our work on foreign interference, because we have already presented a review to the House of Commons that looked at 3 years, and we looked at some 3,000 documents. So this was the most in-depth study done in Canada. We provided that result to the Prime Minister, to the House 3 years ago. So we have asked to continue that work, especially, of course, focusing on the last 2 elections. The question of Mr. Johnston's work and in Syria's review, we don't know what Mr. Johnston will propose, but we have our path, and we have already published and distributed what we are planning to do. So that is our approach. We have not received any comments and have not made any comments about what others are doing. We are focused on our own work. Thank you.
Mr. Julian, please go ahead. 2.5 minutes.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chair. on the issue of foreign interference, the NDP brought forward and Parliament passed the motion calling for a public inquiry. There is no doubt that NCCOP has an important role to play. We also believe firmly that a public inquiry is warranted and needed in this regard. And when we look at the recommendations you put forward that are excellent recommendations, again, there's a sense, as the allegations have come out in the last few months, about allegations of possible support from the Chinese government for certain candidates from a couple of political parties, concerns that have already been raised, raised last year around Russian interference in Canada. We saw this with the so-called Freedom Convoy that caused such misery in downtown Ottawa, depriving people of groceries and medication and sleep. These are major concerns, and I see the recommendations, but I also note that to adequately respond to the threat of foreign interference requires Elections Canada to be bolstered, the disinformation campaigns to be stopped. I see the recommendations, but do you feel that there is warranted for a broader degree of coordination to push back against this, to ensure after you've done your review of previous elections, that we can get the answers for Canadians to ensure that in future elections that we can stop any possibility of those attempts to influence our electorate to be increased or deepened in any way. What about the coordination? You offer these recommendations. What about the coordination to actually getting them implemented?
I'm going to start by saying that you ask a question which perhaps asks us to predict what our recommendations will be on this review, and we haven't done the review yet. So, please excuse me if I don't go so far as to adequately answer that. But let me say, first of all, the recommendations that came out in the first part, now we know, of our foreign interference review were based on the period of study that we looked at. And whether it's that or whether it's cybersecurity, we see the world speeding up in these issues. And so that will be something that will be part of, as we look at this, that we'll understand. And I think that also calls upon us to understand a little bit of the history, how this has come along. I mean, it's not just now that we're finding out about these cases of interference. There have been alarm bells over the years, and I'm one who firmly believes that governments of all political stripes have responded and have put in place measures and have continued to build on those. And if anything, what we will look at is, have they kept pace with the need? But we're not at that point to be able to answer that. I'm sorry.
Thank you. I'm afraid we have to draw the line there. So thank you to NCCOP for all the work you do on an ongoing basis. It's very important. We appreciate your time with us today. It's very helpful. And with that, we are now adjourned. Thank you all.